Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today for this conversation about climate policies for economic development. I'm particularly pleased to be joined by Dr. Mauricio Cárdenas, who is a visiting senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, former finance minister for Colombia, as well as Minister of Energy and Mines, Transport, Economic Development, and Planning at different times. We are also joined by Dr. Ricardo Hausmann, Director of the Growth Lab at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. And I hope you are as pleased as I am to be jumping into this conversation today. We have an hour together, and I'd like to start by inviting my two colleagues to share a few thoughts on this topic. They've each had recent publications and op-eds, and I think that if we draw on those publications, we'll be able to have a really interesting discussion. So Mauricio, would you like to begin?
Well, thank you, Laurie. I'm delighted to be in this panel with you and with Ricardo. I have to say that throughout my life, I've been in a number of panels. I'd say innumerable amount of panels with Ricardo, talking about many issues, but never on issues related to climate. So I think this is basically showing that there is a new pattern, a new trend, which is us, economists and public officials that have been working more in the areas of planning and finance to begin thinking seriously about these issues that we're discussing today, which is climate and development. So I'm going to use this first couple of minutes to share with you that for the last year or so, I was working with a very dear colleague, Helen Mountford, who is at the WRI, co-chairing a task force that was convened by the Carbon Pricing Leadership Initiative, which is a coalition of the private sector, governments, NGOs, with an interest on the issue of carbon pricing. We led a task force to see how carbon pricing was a central element for the net zero goals. So we launched our report yesterday, and the main message is that although there is a lot of ambition and pledges, and many countries, national, subnational corporations are making big announcements, there's almost a competition as to who makes the most significant announcement in terms of reductions in net emissions. There's a relatively lack and scarcity of strategies, of actual tools to really make sure that that happens. And carbon pricing is one of those elements in the toolbox. And it's a component that is not as widely used as you would think. There are about 60 or so countries in the world that are using carbon pricing. But the amount of greenhouse emissions that are covered by those carbon prices is relatively low. And the carbon prices that are aligned with the net zero commitments are even lower. It's only 4% of the greenhouse emissions reduction aligned with the Paris Agreement that are now covered by carbon prices. So carbon prices are either inexistent or are very low to really make a significant impact. It is not a silver bullet. It's just a component. Many other things are needed, but it's a good start. And in our part of the world, in Latin America, carbon prices are still in its very early stages. Just a handful of countries, Mexico, Chile, Colombia. Argentina has a partial system, not a carbon tax, but an emission trading system. But very low coverage and very low taxes. So that means that there's still lots to do in our region, in this area, to make sure that we create incentives, not just for the reduction in carbon emissions, but for investment in innovation to find new technologies that will allow countries to reduce emissions and substitute fossil fuels for other forms of energy. So I'll stop here. There's lots more to talk about these report. There are many things that we cover in the report. But I think throughout the conversation, I'm sure they'll come up.
Absolutely. And I've made a couple of notes of things you mentioned that I'd like to come back to. So I certainly will and remind you of that. Ricardo, I'd like to ask you to share a few opening remarks with the audience.
So let me say that it's a pleasure to be back again with Mauricio in this panel. And he's right to mention that this is the first time that both of us talk about climate, because we've mostly focused on development and macro and so on, but now the climate has gotten into our core business, kind of like into it's become mainstream within our areas of specialty. And I try to work on helping countries figure out how they can grow. And for a long time, the attitude was, well, the fact that we have this climate problem is a constraint on growth, because growth used to be easier because you had more sources of energy that you could use. You didn't have to worry about emissions. So now whatever mediocre growth we were able to achieve before, now we're going to be even more constrained because we have these extra limitations on the process. And that framing, and then the whole dynamic is asking about what are your commitments to reduce your emissions. So you have to do less of something, right? It's hard to grow when you're doing less of things, right? And I think that creates a framing that accentuates the tension between growth or prosperity and sustainability. Mm-hmm. As I started to stumble into issues of green growth in the context of the countries I'm working on in several continents, I stumbled into the following idea, that renewable energy is less transportable than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are uniquely transportable. They're uniquely dense, and makes their transportation very easy, especially liquid hydrocarbons, right? Methane is harder to transport, and it's a headache. You have to liquefy it and then regasify it. It increases the cost enormously, etc. Or you have to invest in a big pipeline, etc. But if you're talking about solar, wind, hydro, it's very hard to transport long distances. This means that the world we live today is a world that is sort of energetically flat, meaning that you can be an energy poor country, say like Korea, and specialize in energy intensive products, say like steel. And if the world is going to decarbonize, it's going to have to use more renewable energies. And the renewable energies are less transportable. So the world is not going to want to make steel in Korea. It will want to make steel in places that are richer in these renewable energy sources. And I think it's going to create a very important reallocation of economic activity. And that countries have to figure out a strategy so that they can play a role in that relocalization of global economic activities, if they happen to be rich in renewable resources. And the way to think about that is not for each country to think about how they're going to reduce their own emissions. We need a strategy that will ensure that we reduce global emissions, not by, say, Koreans shutting down their steel industry and leaving the world without steel, but by activities moving towards places that are rich in green energies. And how do you become rich in green energy, and what do you do about it is one area that I think we'll have some time to discuss in the next hour.
Absolutely. And thank you. I, again, have a couple of thoughts to come back to on that. And I'd like to drill down into these macro comments that both of you have made. Let's start with you, Mauricio. I know that in your task force, you were focused, the work of you and the team were focused on carbon pricing. And one of the things, and because I've reviewed the material you talk about, is taking into account national circumstances and how not all countries will be able to achieve net zero at the same time, which seems like a really obvious concept. And it feeds into some of the things Ricardo was saying about how countries will have to look across this supply chain and think about where can they play, which is, I think, ultimately where we're headed. But knowing that countries cannot all achieve net zero at the same time, and focusing for the moment, Mauricio, on carbon pricing schemes, and thinking about, again, let's move to our thoughts to Latin America and the areas that the three of us particularly know well. For the next hour, let's focus on that. How could carbon pricing schemes be implemented or help to achieve net zero, knowing that in Latin America, they've been used, as you described, in a spotty fashion, so to speak? Do you see carbon pricing schemes as a tool in the toolbox to be implemented more broadly in Latin America? Thinking as a former policy.
Sure. Well, let me begin with the first sentence you made, which is the issue of the just or fair transition, which I think is a very relevant concept, because it's the idea is, well, we were throughout the history. I mean, this is a history that began in the mid 19th century, when really global emissions began to increase. We have not, as a region, contributed much to that, and that just reflects in the fact that our level of per capita income is relatively low, at least compared to the advanced economy. So it's not something that the region really cost. It's in that sense, it's not the main responsibility of Latin America. But on the other hand, for geographical reasons, we're very exposed to the effects of climate change. So we really have to be part of that conversation, because if you look at the countries that are most vulnerable to extreme weather events, I'd say out of the 25 countries that are most vulnerable, about 19 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's something that we cannot ignore. Just and fair transition refers to the fact that not everyone has to do the same amount of effort at the same time. And this connects with another concept, which I think is very important, which is the concept of energy poverty. Because this is a region, I'm speaking from Colombia right now, this is a region where there's still significant energy poverty. One extreme case is Haiti, where almost half of the population still uses wood as a main source of energy. So that basically says we need to overcome the issue of energy poverty. We need to reduce emissions, but we need to do it in a way that is fair and more just, in the sense that others probably have more responsibility. So that's the essence. Now, how do you translate this into the topic of carbon pricing? Well, it means that if the world is saying that to achieve net zero by 2050, carbon prices should be around, say, $50, $60. Some countries are talking about $100 per ton of CO2. Well, maybe you don't need to get there in Latin America, because that would just basically make people poorer. And that's essentially something that will go against the idea of development. But the one issue I've been thinking more about lately is how can we do this transition in a way that we at the same time accelerate our development and reduce our energy poverty. So yes, we understand the idea of the just and fair transition, but not to say, well, we don't have to do this. We should do it. We should get into the energy transition in a way that deals with a long-standing problem of the region, which is low economic growth and high inequality. So are these two goals easy and possible to reconcile? Can we develop the region? Can we accelerate development and at the same time engage in the energy transition? And I think yes, but the how to is not obvious. And I think that's what we need to think more and focus in terms of our research is energy transition, yes, but how to make sure that accelerates development in Latin America. And I think that's a great topic. We can talk about that more in the next few minutes.
Yeah, let's following that, which is taking the concept, and I think Ricardo, you spoke about this really well, and in your op-ed, in your article in Project Syndicate that came across, we are not the need to decouple the concept of what is an appropriate climate policy from this idea of only restricting, as you just said. It should be about more than just restricting emissions, lowering emissions in a negative discourse that could imply it being thought of as a loss of something and having a negative impact on economic growth. How do we turn that around into a thought process, a policy that is good for economic growth for a region that needs to continue growing, that needs to find a way to grow, and thinking about that from the perspective of finding a role in a new green economy, as you talk about. And one of the things your article talked about that I was really interested in was studying emerging value chains. And you talk about how countries should look at these emerging value chains in the new green economy. And you have this great concept of the role of a chief scientist. And I wanted to ask you, how can a developing nation's government in Latin America, for example, how can a Latin American government facing old paradigms of economic growth turn it around and operationalize this concept of studying these emerging value chains, as you put it, or looking at the new green economy? How would you, if you were advising a chief scientist in a new construct, advise them?
Okay, so it's easier if we make it a bit concrete. So suppose we're talking about Venezuela or Colombia or Chile. What are the costs? What are the options going forward? Venezuela and Colombia have significant assets invested in coal and hydrocarbons that are deeply emitting. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, so we think, and most of those reserves are in very, very heavy crudes that emit a lot of CO2 per unit of energy that they would emit. Venezuela is going to have problems finding investors who are willing to make long-term investments for the extraction of that oil because they will fear that those assets will remain stranded. Most of those reserves probably will remain stranded in the sense that, as Sheikh Yamani was famous of saying, the Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of stones, and the oil age will not end because the world ran out of oil, because we would have killed the planet if it does, right? So those assets will remain stranded, and way before they remain stranded, financial markets will not want to invest in developing it. So for Venezuela and for Colombia, this represents, on the one hand, a major challenge. Okay, their main exports are going to be restricted by a green agenda. On the other hand, Venezuela has the Caroni River, which is the best hydroelectric river in the world. Water starts raining at 2,400 meters over sea level, and then the water goes all the way down to close to sea level on the Caroni River. It's massive. It's 8,000 tons of water per second. It's a massive river. It's steep, etc. So we can extract a lot of energy from that river. We've made the bulk of the investments to extract that energy. The remaining ones are small, and the previous ones have allowed to be depreciated or collapse. So it doesn't take too much to get much more energy from that river. Now, with that energy, which is green energy, you could make steel, you could make aluminum, but it would be green steel, it would be green aluminum. And it should have a differential price in markets so that if you do steel and aluminum in a dirty way, you're going to have to pay Mauricio's carbon tax, and you're not going to be as profitable as if you make it green, right? So de facto, there's going to be a price differential between green products and gray products, even though they look identical to you. Right? So it's very important that we create an environment in which these things that can be done in a green way become really profitable, and they can attract a lot of capital to make things in a green way in the country. Okay, Colombia has, they are proud to say that they have 3 mountain chains, and it's a very rainy place. So in principle, they should have a lot of hydropower to extract that. Now, hydro is always very controversial because it pits two parts of the ecological community once against the other, the ones that are concerned about global warming and the ones that are concerned about preserving the natural environment. And that's going to be a natural tension there. How much of the hydro energy of the world can we actually mobilize? And how can we negotiate with communities and so on, the development of hydro initiatives? But those are going to be the issues of materializing that green growth strategy. In the case of Chile, Chile has the Atacama Desert, which is sort of like the Saudi Arabia of solar energy. It competes with the Namibian desert and with the outback in Western Australia as the places with most solar insolation in the world. So you can generate you get a lot of solar energy. What do you do with it? Well, you can make electricity, but maybe you can do things that use electricity, but it's a very variable electricity. So you can't put really a steel plant run by solar, but you can take the solar and transform it into hydrogen. Okay, so now you have hydrogen. What do you do with hydrogen? Well, there are some people who are betting, well, you compress hydrogen, you make it liquid, and then you use it as a fuel the way we do with natural gas. I think it's going to be more problematic than natural gas because it's even less caloric. It's less energy dense than natural gas. So I'm not sure that the way forward is going to be hydrogen as a fuel, but probably the way forward is going to be hydrogen as transformed into ammonia, and ammonia transformed into fertilizers. Or maybe the hydrogen, through a process that they call Fischer-Tropsch, you can transform into hydrocarbons directly. And it has the beauty that the carbons in the hydrocarbons are going to come from the CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's going to be green hydrocarbons, green plastics, etc. So if you are in Chile, you want to say, okay, I have the Atacama Desert. How do I go from Atacama to green plastics or to green whatever? So what are the value chains? What are the mechanisms? What are the investors? There's a lot to figure out. All of this assumes that, as I was saying before, that Mauricio is successful in generating an economic system that prices green products differently from dirty products.
Well, speaking of Mauricio and his success in creating that economic system, Mauricio, let's follow that line of reasoning and talk a little bit about how you were talking about this being an opportunity as opposed to a cost, right? I want to think about this as an opportunity.
I think that's the tension, that's the dilemma. I think many people will tend to see this as a cost and as a burden. And I think it's our role to make sure that the incentives are there to make this an opportunity. So Ricardo just enumerated a number of possibilities and options that are there. And let me kind of like build on that.
Perfect.
So the world has committed to net zero by mid-century. And there are a number of emissions that are going to be almost impossible to abate because there are things that we will not be able to do without carbon emissions. There are some sectors today that we just haven't found the technologies to do without carbon emissions. So presumably by say 2050, there'll be some emissions, maybe not as many as there are now, but there'll be some. And the only way to get to net zero, that's the net aspect of it, is if you do removals.
Yes.
And if you do removals and you actually store and you make sure that they don't come up again. So we're in a very unique position in Latin America, and especially in South America, to contribute to removals, because we have the rainforests, we have the Amazon, but we're just doing the opposite thing. We're destroying it, and we're making it we're making it less of a sink and more of a source in itself, the Amazon. So first thing we need to know is we need it as a sink, but we need to monetize that sink, because so far the only revenue that gets, that comes out of the Amazon is people that are basically destroying the forest and using it for agriculture or for lumber. And we need to make sure it has more value. It has much more value as a sink, but we're not monetizing it.
Right.
So first of all, I think once a carbon market, a global carbon market that is integrated, it's developed, that's a source of income for us, because we're in a very unique position to serve as a sink and to charge for that. Mm-hmm. Because that'll make life a lot easier for the rest of the world. Number two, we may not be the ones with the technology to produce the solar panels, or the wind energy technology. We're buying it. It's a technology that has improved a lot. Now we can generate electricity at a lower cost than we used to, and now it's even more competitive than, I say, including hydro. But so we don't have the technology. That's not basically our opportunity, but we can do it in a more efficient way, because as Ricardo said, we may have more exposure to solar energy, we may have more wind, and we also have more water, which is very important. So, we can be a good source of clean energy. But to really make use of that, we need to integrate our grid. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that because these renewable non-conventional projects tend to be smaller, more isolated, more apart from each other. It's not like the huge dams that produce hydropower. It's a much more decentralized system. So we need the grid. So we need to invest in the grid, which brings me to the issue of capital. So we need capital, and the best way in which the advanced economies can help us is providing us with the capital in terms of, in conditions or under conditions that are much more attractive to us. It's part of what the U.S. government could do, help us with access to that less expensive capital. Now, we also have, as I said before, water, and water is key for hydrogen, as Ricardo mentioned. So for green hydrogen, you need solar energy or wind energy, and you need water. So you need the mix of both, and then you can turn it into ammonia. And there are countries that are planning, like Japan, using ammonia as a substitute for natural gas. In fact, designing the ships that will take the ammonia to Japan, consuming ammonia throughout the trip. They're already developing that technology. So anyway, there are lots of opportunities here. There are lots of opportunities so that we can take advantage of this transition. Now we need to pay for it. And that brings the issue of fossil fuels, because we're a fossil fuel rich region. So are we going to renege on the fossil fuels and then develop these alternative energies? Or should we use the revenues from the fossil fuels to pay for the transition? There are many politicians in the region that are saying, stop the fossil fuels, don't explore. That will be among the first that will basically reduce the production of natural gas or oil. And I think that's wrong. I think we need those revenues to pay for the transition, because otherwise we will be left in a vacuum without the revenues from fossil fuels and without having built these alternatives. So rather than a shock therapy, which is cut fossil fuels immediately, I think we need the type of medicine that is, you're going to start reducing your dependence, your addiction, slowly. That's the type of therapy that Latin America needs, and then you'll start building these other strengths so that your economy will succeed in the future, not with fossil fuels, but with clean energies.
You both brought up some really interesting points I'd like to comment and draw you back into the conversation on. Mauricio, you have talked about bridging, essentially how to bridge from fossil fuel dependency into other options, such as the options that Ricardo mentioned. And Ricardo talked about, green hydrogen, and Chile has a great green hydrogen program moving forward that I think a number of us are familiar with. Ricardo, you talked about existing large hydro, which undoubtedly we have to look carefully at how it's impacted by climate change and sources, but run-of-the-river hydro, I think you were alluding to in terms of Venezuela. And there are certainly things to be studied there. But I think the broader question of how to transition from existing energy use patterns of generation such that are fossil fuel dependent now to other economic systems, and that is ultimately the energy transition. Mauricio, if I understand what you're saying, is you are of the opinion that, as you put it, shock therapy or a brusque transition is not economically viable. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think shock therapy will make us poorer.
Okay, and that brings us to the just transition, right? So let's look at. Please jump in, Ricardo.
Mauricio, before we go there, I think there's one important asset that we have in the world of capture beyond the Amazon, which I fully agree with Mauricio. That is, we should make it into a sink, but right now it's a source, and it's very dangerous because deforestation is happening very quickly, and we don't have the right tools and policies to prevent it. And this is a headache that we have to be working on. And I'm currently working on that issue in the context of Colombia. But another way to capture CO2 is by just capturing the CO2 and injecting it underground, for which you need a technology to capture it, and you need a place underground to store it. There, countries like Colombia and Venezuela that have all these oil fields, they have sort of like the natural geology to store the CO2. And so we could be storing CO2. The question is, how do we capture it? And I think that there's bound to be a technological breakthrough. My friend Dan Schrag, who's a professor here at Harvard and has a patent that is in the process of being approved, that has a chemical process, a substance that captures the CO2 from the air, and a chemical process to then release that CO2 again, and so you can capture it. So, and that has the advantage that you can do the capture anywhere in the planet. So you don't have to put the capture in a thermal power plant. At the moment when the CO2 is being created, you can capture it from the atmosphere anywhere in the world, and you would locate those facilities close to where you have good underground sinks to put the CO2 in. So I think that in itself, that could be a big growth industry, a carbon capture in itself. And I think the comparative advantage there is going to be, on the one hand, mastering the technology, but on the other hand, having proximity to good geological places to store the CO2. This puts the accent on the second topic that Mauricio mentioned, but where I would want to encourage Mauricio to be a little bit more optimistic, or at least a little bit more call to action. on the issue of technology. I don't want to give up on the idea that we Latin Americans are useless in technology. That I think the technologies that are needed are technologies that don't exist, and the people that have to come up with these technologies, are young people, 20-something, 30-something, that will either locate in one places or in others, and I don't see why they wouldn't locate in Latin America. So I want to say, Chile knew for centuries that they had the Atacama Desert. They knew for a long time that they were energy poor and everything else, right? That they paid a huge cost for the fact that they were reliant on Argentinian natural gas that then didn't materialize. So it's strategic for them to make solar energy a big thing. It's strategic for us to make carbon capture a big thing. It's strategic for us to explore the technological possibilities that can change our national development path and could make us masters of these new emerging technologies. So I very much want to encourage the region, a call to action to the region, that technology is a fundamental reason why we're still emitting CO2, that technology is the binding constraint that we have to remove, and that we have smart young people that can contribute to that, and we should definitely take it upon us to try to master as much as possible from those needed emerging technologies.
Let me say something.
Go ahead, Mauricio. I could tell that you were dying to say something. So please.
Needless to say that I'm a big fan of development technologies and investing in research and development, and that's of course what we need to do. But let's think in the scenario that even without us being at the forefront of the technological development, how we can make this an opportunity. Of course, if we are the technology developers, that'll be fantastic. I mean, that would be just it will not make this question relevant, because of course we will benefit from the energy transition. But let's assume for a second that we are not, so that we need to kind of like think, well, how are we going to take advantage of this? And I'd say you made a very good point, which is even if we're not the ones developing the solar panels, solar panels will be deployed easily. It's a tradable good. It's very easy to move, but we will be very competitive in producing solar energy because of our natural endowments. And then we can produce green steel, or we could be the producers. And you mentioned that, and I think that's a good point. It's a valid point. But I'll make another example or another case for the opportunity. Where is the opportunity here? So as the costs of electricity are coming down using clean energy, I think we need to think in how to accelerate the use of electricity in our countries. So we need to electrify a number of sectors, beginning with transport. So our cities in Latin America have real issues with the quality of the air, and of course that affects respiratory diseases. So we need to be, pushing very hard for a transformation of the transportation systems into electric buses, for example, or metros. But we need to go that direction, and that in itself generates jobs, and that in itself generates also better living standards. So I'll mention that as one specific area in which we can do this and make this an opportunity. I think politically also is very appealing. People like that. People support measures by mayors, by national governments that go in that direction. And I think we still have a long way to go. Our cities are congested with buses that are, prehistoric in terms of emissions. And the last thought about the opportunity side of this. It has to do with agriculture. One of the big issues in Latin America is the emissions associated with the changes in land use. So I think this is an opportunity for us to reduce carbon emissions by changing agricultural practices and producing these the basically food for the world that is also carbon neutral, so that we are at the forefront of the meat industry, the produce industry that has the highest standards and it's clean. I think we need to be at the forefront in that area as well.
Very interesting, and of course I agree in terms of the opportunities that exist. And having spent a large part of my own career in the region, living in the region, I have seen these dynamics and challenges and opportunities present themselves in daily life and in very real ways. I'd like to turn to the questions that we're getting through the Zoom chat box and ask them to both of you, because I think that they will enrich our conversation. And we received a question that I think is a very important one, because we're talking about opportunities, and all of these opportunities rely on investment, and they rely on policies, and they rely on actions to be taken in a specific framework. And we got a question about the strength or lack thereof of the institutional frameworks, and I would add legal and regulatory, in Latin America, that of course vary by country. But our question is the issue of the poor, or I would say in some cases poor and in some cases not, institutional frameworks in Latin America. So could you, either of you, comment on the institutional frameworks and the questions that would need to be addressed, or what would need to come from the regulatory and legal frameworks in different countries in Latin America to provide, to ensure that this energy transition as an opportunity for economic growth?
Good. Let me take a first crack at it. I think that, we tend to have lousy legal frameworks for the things that we do. We have hopelessly lousy legal frameworks for the things that we don't yet do. So it's gonna be a whole adventure to move the legal framework to this new era. In a country like my own, Venezuela has massive subsidies on fossil fuels. So we have a long history, and other countries in the region too, of subsidizing fossil fuels. And if we're now going to move to carbon taxation, that implies a very significant change in relative prices. And we're going to have to deal with the political economy of that transition in relative prices. Mauricio wanted the transition to be gradual. And I fully agree with the advantages of gradualism, but there are dimensions of gradualism that should not be incompatible with a quick transition in incentives. Let me give an example. Suppose I say, you know what, I cannot impose a very high carbon tax on my country. And then other countries are going to say, well, then I'm going to assume that your country is dirty. And if I'm going to do for international trade, since you have a low carbon tax, I'm going to put a border adjustment tax on your carbon. And then you cannot materialize on all the gains of the stuff I was talking about in terms of getting into producing green stuff, right? Because then you're not all that green. So you would have to create a legal framework to certify the greenness of things. And you would have to have a mechanism through which, green products have a price and gray products have a different price, whether directly or indirectly through the tax system. But the world is not going to accept that because of history, you're going to be allowed to export more gray stuff than as the world, and limit everybody else's production of green stuff. So my guess is that the transition, the optimal path would have something like a drastic transition of relative prices. And the gradualism is going to come really from the use of the tax, of the carbon tax income. Because we've said, who has to pay the carbon tax? We haven't said who gets to spend the carbon tax. So my guess is that probably the optimal mix is something relatively drastic on incentives, and you buy your gradualism through the use of carbon, of the money that comes from carbon taxation. And maybe through that, we might even innovate in more inclusive social policies.
Mauricio, would you like to comment as well?
Yeah, well, this is a great point. Let me make two comments. One is, when we introduced the carbon tax here in Colombia, which is a relatively low tax, it's $5 per ton of CO2, we thought, well, what to do with the proceeds? And mostly because of a political consideration, because it made it viable in Congress, we decided that the proceeds of the tax would be directed, earmarked, to the preservation of those areas of the country that had been destroyed, damaged, because of the conflict, because of the deforestation associated with the expansion of the illicit crops. So it's actually earmarked for reforestation and for the protection of our natural parks. But listening to Ricardo, it really makes a lot of sense that you use part of those revenues for research and development, that you should actually be investing in research and development to pay for the transition and to develop the technologies and to make sure that you have the capacity to innovate and to accelerate the transition. Now, in thinking about the institutions and what's the institutional setting that allows this to happen, I have to be honest and say, and this is a question that was made by one of the participants, Anias or Nis. I haven't really thought about this long enough, but my initial response is this. This is a problem that really can be solvable only if you have the incentives to make long-term decisions and decisions that you're able to enforce, that you don't change course every 2, 3, 4 years. This is a long-term issue. So you need stability, you need continuity, and you need to make sure, for example, if we're going to get into hydrogen, for the development of hydrogen in Latin America, you need public money. It's impossible to do it just with the private sector. It's huge and is very risky. So you need the public sector, but you don't need the public sector for 1 or 2 years. You probably need it for 10 or 20 years. So the type of institutions that will allow this to happen, will allow the region to seize this opportunity, are institutions that are not that common, are institutions that basically are able to make credible commitments, enforceable commitments that do not change with the color of the party who is in power at any one point in time. So that is the institutional framework that we need to think about, because otherwise this is not going to work.
I'd like to.
Can I just?
Yeah, please, Ricardo, and then I'll jump in. Go ahead.
One extra idea that I wanted to share, and that is that part of the institutional framework that is missing is international. I think we will have to revisit all our international trading rules, so that international trading rules distinguish between green and gray products, and is compatible with differentiation of those prices and so on. it allows, market access for, the green products of one country to the rest of the world. If everybody takes a policy where they have national commitments to reduce their own emissions, and they can do anything in the process, etc., they may kill the opportunities for other people, other countries to help the world lower its emissions by developing activities there. So if there's going to be a global carbon tax, it's a good question. If there's a global allocation of those revenues, are they going to be shared internationally, or is it just every tub on its own bottom? Each country gets to spend the taxes they collect, or is there, are they going to be recirculated, etc.? Which goes a little bit to the issue that Mauricio was talking about on the importance of green finance in this story. So I think that there's a very big piece of work to go into how to make green growth globally fair and balanced through international institutions.
My comment actually fits right in with what you just said, Ricardo, and it also plays off one of the questions we have through the chat from Manili Hernandez, which refers to Mexico, and it has to do with individual country level politics. And Manili asks us about AMLO's current energy policy in Mexico, which has been a huge shift back to fossil fuel based generation through a dispatch that is no longer marginal cost based dispatch, has moved renewables to the bottom of the dispatch stack in generation, and is dispatching the dirtiest forms of fuel-based generation, regardless of where they fall in the merit order. And it got me thinking, Manili, since I saw your question, and as I've been following this conversation about the tension between internal domestic politics and this global situation, and the frameworks we may need at a global level, and what can occur inside a country. And I'm very familiar with the Mexican energy sector, having worked there. And one of the things we have not talked about in this conversation that I think is tremendously important is the global financial sector, and that will play a role in all of this because we are already seeing it. And I think that we need to take into consideration how international financial markets will be exerting a different pressure as well. And investors will be putting their own conditions and will be exerting power. And I think that when you were talking, Mauricio, about where the funds will come from, and you and I have actually written about this, and the role the United States could play. But when I think also about commercial banks lending to projects, and I think about the ratings, the bond debt coming out of Mexico, or Pemex's rating or CFE's rating, they've been downgraded already. I want to say Pemex at least twice, CFE twice, and Mexico twice. And we will see more and more ESG considerations as these companies and country debt is evaluated. And we're going to see, I think, that type of pressure affecting the choices that countries and state-owned enterprises in the energy sector are making. And I think that that's just a consideration that we should take into account.
If I could say a word about that, because it really connects with what both of you were saying. In lack of global institutions and a global architecture that will enforce this and will tell every country in the world what to do, and how to get to net zero, and in lieu of agreements that have all the clauses that will allow everyone and will assure that everyone complies, financing can play a very important role. So finance is crucial here, because more and more we're going to see creditors interested in ensuring that their money is invested in compliant countries compliant corporations. They're actually the investors in these funds, the owners of this capital are going to be looking at these dimensions. So finance is going to be crucial. I'm now, this is something I developed in the past year or so. I'm looking at bond issues globally, ESG bonds or just green bonds, you name it. And if one aspect is very prominent in this data is the very, very limited participation of Latin America. It's just a handful of corporations, almost no governments have actually participated in that market. So this means that we're behind, and we need more corporations, we need more governments issuing these type of instruments. What's the importance of these instruments? Where's the magic? The magic is that in the new vintages of these mechanisms, your coupon rate, the interest you pay on the debt goes up if you don't comply with your commitments, if you don't reduce your emissions. And there are people that are going to be watching, enforcing, there are third parties that are going to be auditing, and this really creates the incentive. So part of the institutional weakness at the local level can be compensated by the fact that these the financial markets are going to play an important role. And one last word about this. The multilateral development banks and the regional development banks have to start giving us the incentives to do this. So if you're going to lend for this type of projects, your interest is going to be much lower than for these other projects. And this should allow countries, even that have low credit ratings, but are investing in the right projects, to have access to a very competitive cost of capital. This is a change in model. This is a new way of thinking about capital flows, but I think it's the right way.
Thank you, Mauricio. Ricardo, I guess we're almost out of time. Would you like to make a quick comment before we wrap up?
Let me say that there's a couple of areas where I think we should explore green growth. I mean, we know Latin America has huge resources in lithium. Lithium is the ideal storage device for many uses in electricity. I think that there's a whole lithium value chain. You know, if lithium battery prices keep on coming down the way they have, then there'll be no issue that, you know, everybody will want an electric car simply because it's so much cheaper than a traditional car. And that transition would happen very, very quickly. We have a role to play in that transition. And let me end with a challenge to Latin American corporations. To a first approximation, Latin American universities are publishing at a rate which is 15% of the per capita rate of scientific publications in the US. So whatever is 1/15, the US is producing like 7 times more scientific publications per capita than Latin America, and that's, you know, a problem for our universities. How can we get our universities to be more scientifically, prolific? But Latin American corporations are patenting at a rate which is 1% of the US rate. So US is 100 times, something between 70 and 100 times more prolific at making innovations and patenting them than Latin American corporations. Said differently, Latin America publishes 15 times more papers than patents relative to the share in the US. So it means that to some extent, the scientific university basis for the technological innovations that need to happen has already been developed, not maybe to the ideal extent, but to a much, much larger extent than the rate at which corporations are using that capacity to innovate. So my challenge is to Latin American corporations, get off your comfortable seats. There is a challenge here to make risky, smart investments in innovation, leverage the research capacities that the region has already invested. I think the evidence is that the problem is more on the side of the corporations than on the side of the universities, but they are both part of the solution. And that if we want to move forward, there is a big agenda that involves business and universities in the technologies, in the adaptation, the adoption, the improvement of the technologies that this green agenda will require.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Mauricio, any last words?
Yeah, well, there's one question of someone who says that she or he is skeptical that Latin America can actually, take advantage of this. I think skepticism is the right attitude because we need to figure out how to do this right. I like much more that approach. You're a skeptic. You need to make sure that this is going to work. Then people are going to say, the people that are saying now, oh, yes, we need to reduce our carbon emissions. We need to be net zero by 2050. We need to increase our pledges, but without a strategy. So we need a strategy, and skepticism is always the road to strategies.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you.
We need the skeptics.
We do. We need the skeptics. We need our thinkers. And on that note, I'd like to thank both of you, Mauricio, Ricardo. I'd like to thank the Colombia Global Center in Santiago, Chile, and from the Center on Global Energy Policy at the School of International Public Affairs, the Columbia University. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.